You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I'm chatting about pensions on divorce, sometimes a controversial topic, but to make sense of it today, I have Natalie Lester along with me. Natalie is a partner in the family team at Debenhams Ottaway. Thanks so much for joining the podcast, Natalie.
Thank you, David. It's great to be here.
We're going to talk about why pensions need to be prioritised on divorce, your experience of how they're best fairly divided. And I use the word fair in inverted commas because it's such an arbitrary term, isn't it? But in the first instance, tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you do at Debenhams Ottaway? What's your specialism? And how long have you been practicing for?
So, I'm a partner at Debenhams Ottaway. I'm a family solicitor, and I've been working in family law for just over 13 years now. And I deal with all things family. So that's divorce, money, prenups, living together agreements, children matters, and also surrogacy.
We're going to talk about pensions in particular today. What is your experience? Why is that pension pot such an important part of the divorce discussion?
Well, pensions are often one of a couple's most valuable assets. So in some cases, especially public sector and final salary pensions, even a company pension, it can actually be worth more than the couple's main home. So it's really important for our clients to understand how the pensions work and the options available to them when we negotiate their financial settlement. And often they're overlooked and undervalued in divorce.
There's so much talk about the value of pensions, the fact that final salary pensions seem to be disappearing. You've got public sector on strike because they're not being paid enough and therefore their pensions aren't high enough. And of course you've got the whole debate about what pension age is. I mean, for me personally, it seems unlikely I shall be able to retire until I'm at least 70. What are you seeing in terms of the value of pensions at the moment? I mean, are they still as valuable as that, or have they sort of come down a little bit?
Well, it really depends on what type of pension you have. And although there are changes and, you don't see as many final salary pensions nowadays, but we still see large pensions. And as I say, still sometimes more valuable than the family home, depending on what type of pot they have. And making sure clients understand, like you say, the importance of how old are they going to have to work until, will the state pensions still be around? And that's a big question mark for some of us, depending how old your listeners are, but it will vary. So it's why it's even more important that we consider how our clients are going to live in retirement, especially in a long marriage where they thought everything was going to be pulled together. Perhaps they were going to rely on just one spouse's pension that was a lot larger.
And is it still the case, and this is perhaps a very sexist question, but is it still the case that it's predominantly the man's pension that is the larger pot? Or again, are you sort of seeing any change in that trend?
Not really. Despite centuries of progress towards gender equality, the fact does still remain that where a couple decides to have children, there's obviously usually one parent who makes the sacrifice in their career in order to care for the children, and still very stereotypically we do still see that is the woman. That doesn't mean in all cases, and I do have cases where it is the other way around, but by and large, yes, it is still the wife.
So in your experience, what are you advising clients when it comes to pensions? How are you advising them to split that in the settlement?
there's lots of different things that we have to consider when sharing a pension. So we have to look at whether an arrangement will provide the parties with enough capital now and in the future. And we have to look at whether the proposed arrangement provides the parties with enough income now and in the future to meet their needs. And there's things that we have to consider, like tax consequences, whether there's any health concerns, and all sorts of factors to take into account. So what we do, I mean, usually once we start talking about pensions with clients, we go through the different ways the court can deal with them, so how they can essentially be split, how you can actually get your share. So the most common that I see, and most family lawyers do, is the pension sharing order. So that's where an instruction will be given to the pension scheme administrator, and there'll be a percentage of the spouse's pension value which will be transferred to the other spouse, essentially. And what we have to consider is, well, obviously, what is that percentage? Usually, especially in a long marriage, we're looking at providing the parties with an equal income upon retirement. And to do that, we have to get a pension actuary involved in most cases, depending upon values and other factors. But the other option, which we get a lot of questions from clients, is what we call offsetting. So that's the process where a right to a certain asset is essentially traded off against another asset. So one of the most common approaches is for one party to offset their right to receive a pension income later against getting, for example, a greater share of the family home or other investments. With that, we would usually want a pension actuary to be able to do that calculation, because it's just not as simple as saying, a pound for a pound. A pension asset is a riskier asset and very different to getting cash in your hand. And the other options that are still available, but very rare, I haven't done one in many years, possibly, maybe right at the beginning over 10 years ago, but their pension attachment orders and earmarking. So pension attachment orders are payments made directly from the member's scheme straight to their ex's bank account. But they're very uncommon because, due to their limitations, that you've got to wait until your spouse actually retires, and there's also issues if they were to pass away. So pension sharing orders are the most common when sharing pensions.
Is that a trend that you've been seeing whilst you've been in practice then, Natalie?
Yes, I haven't done a pension attachment order or earmarking in the last 10 years.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I really like about the podcast and talking to practitioners, is that I think sometimes we can get very blinkered, can't we? We kind of do things one way, and we're not always completely convinced that other people are in the same boat as us. And it's really great to hear different people's opinion, different people's views, and often empathize with them. Can I just come back very quickly? You talked about the fact that you do prenups as part of your work as well. Again, are you increasingly including pensions advice as part of the prenup agreement?
Oh, absolutely. We have to cover all the elements. So a lot of the time, I mean, most commonly they go, oh, we just want a clean break and to have no claims on that. And depending on who's got the most valuable pension, depending whether we're for the financially weaker party or the one who has the main bulk of the money, will depend on our advice. But prenups should be reviewed regularly anyway. So whilst they usually come to us, before the marriage or just after, they will review it, and potentially, if they have gone for a no claim on pensions, they can then amend that in, let's say, 5-10 years as the marriage gets longer, because they'll start to get the advice that it's becoming a long marriage now, and we need to look at fairness and what the court will look at if it's ever needed.
And I guess pensions remain pretty adversarial. I don't suppose any one side is going to want to give up particularly if it's a final salary pension, for example. Any one side is going to want to give that up.
Yes, it's definitely one of the main bone of contentions. I've had many clients, and I still do. And in that first meeting, they say the most important thing to me is keeping all of my pension. And if they're in a long marriage, I have to deliver the bad news that is unlikely to happen unless there's a lot of capital in the pot potentially. If they've got a very valuable pension, we can look at the offsetting option, of course, but a lot of the time there isn't, and it's just the pension and a house and some other bits.
You've used this term long marriage a couple of times in the discussion. Is there a definition of long marriage? Again, is there a trend there that any lengthening or shortening of the length of marriage in terms of the way courts are treating pensions?
Well, in terms of long marriage, there isn't actually a definition of years. Short marriage is usually sort of up to 3-4 years, and then it starts to get grey. 5 to 6 years, you start to see that, I'm getting medium, and then sort of 10 years, 15 years. I mean, 20 years plus is absolutely long marriage, and then I think we're in a bit of a grey. But you could argue that it is.
I'm going to drill into it a touch more because
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting point because, I mean, heaven forbid the law actually presents a black and white, obviously,
Mm.
but that must be a really difficult, and I don't know what the average length of marriages is, but it wouldn't surprise me if, somewhere between 10 and or 7 to 15 years is, not a million miles away from median marriages. How do you deal with that on a practical level, and how are the courts approaching that?
It's on a case-by-case basis, which I know isn't very helpful because it's not just the length of the marriage. There are other factors that need to be considered. What I can say is that the pensions will need to be shared, or there'll need to be an offsetting option if it is a long marriage and there's a big disparity between their pensions, or they've got different types of pensions.
And what other problems arise out of this whole pensions debate?
So I have seen, and it is primarily women who come to me and say they've made an agreement with their ex-spouse to be. We're all fine. I'm happy. I'm getting the majority of the house. He is keeping his pension, and there might be a few other assets that they've agreed on. And I then, start to go through the assets, and I start to hear about perhaps the final salary pension. They're not sure of the value of it. They've just agreed this. And that can be difficult because we have to say that we don't advise to agree to this. You've gone and had this conversation, you feel it's all sorted, and then it comes across that the family lawyer is trying to pick everything apart and ruin the wonderful agreement that they had, which isn't the case. Is we've got to make sure that our client understands what they are agreeing. What they've agreed isn't legally binding with their partner in that way that I've described anyway. But what I find is that, and not all of the time, but the other spouse may be quite financially savvy and know what they're doing, and often the other spouse isn't. So they're not really realizing what they are agreeing. They might not realize that the pension they've agreed not to claim on is far more valuable than a lovely £200,000 lump sum that they're being offered. And because who wouldn't want £200,000 in their hands, and to think, that could go towards my house, or I could get X, Y, or Z, and then a pension that's not that tangible asset, and to be explaining how important that income is in retirement, which could be 20 years away for them. So even harder to understand the urgency of agreeing that now and maybe not having the 200,000 or whatever amount it is. So yeah, I see problems in that respect.
And is that a regular occurrence? People come to you with almost like a ready-made agreement, a verbal agreement of some description that kind of says, look, my husband and I are settling, or my wife and I are divorcing. We've agreed this nominally. And then obviously, as you say, you get involved and throw things up in the air a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's very common. And myself and my team, we take a very collaborative approach, which means that we, adopt an amicable approach. We encourage that the parties have these discussions. It's not something that we are against. However, we very much explain that you need to have legal advice alongside that process. Because we don't want to then think for the parties to feel that everything's done, and then the lawyer, then ends up the lawyers unpicking that agreement. But we explain that it's to make sure that the deal you're getting is fair. That's our priority.
And you touched on age as well, and the fact that perhaps people are getting divorced in their 30s, 40s, whatever it might be, and retirement seems an awful long way away. So it doesn't necessarily constitute part of their thinking and part of their conversation.
Yeah, possibly. When you think, oh, I've got another 30 years to go, it's not usually at the forefront of their mind. They want to just split what there is now, the house, the investments, maybe a holiday home abroad. And that's it. That's their priority and urgency, and get the money in the bank. And obviously a roof over their head, which is extremely important, meeting the parties' housing needs, making sure they've got enough. So it's bringing that to the forefront and saying the pension is just as important, and we do need to consider that and all of the issues around it.
And I guess the misnomer here is that any settlement on pensions is for people who, have got large pension pots or perhaps a high net worth. But this is as relevant to people that are on lower incomes as it is on higher incomes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, there can be a really we do have cases as well. It's not just the high net worth cases where the capital in the pot is modest, but the one thing the main asset they've got is a generous pension, one of the parties usually. So yeah, it's just as important in those cases to sort it. And they still need to receive this advice, even if the pension pot is small.
Well, and that's the resolution, isn't it? That's how I guess that's how you sort of end up solving this issue, is that as long as you've advised the client, they don't have to take your advice. I mean, when do clients ever take a lawyer's advice? But they don't have to take the advice, but you've told them about it, and that's a really important part of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Pensions are a very complex area. We have to explain the dangers of overlooking a pension and what it might mean for them, and try and help them see the wood from the trees. But we can only advise and tell them what we think is their best option, and then it is up to them. At the end of the day, they make the final call.
We've had a couple of podcasts recently where we've talked about the emotional turmoil that people are going through during a divorce, and that in some cases people simply aren't ready to have that conversation. They're unable to have that conversation, and even though you're giving them that advice, it's not registering with them. Is that an issue that you come across?
Yes, absolutely. Very common. And usually in my first meeting with the client, that's all discussed, where are you at the moment? How are things going? How are you feeling? And know it, because sometimes, and I have had to give this advice, I don't think you are ready yet to make this decision. I don't think you are in the right headspace. And we very much work with a team around us. You don't just have your family lawyer. I don't just work alone. I make sure that my clients and the team make sure that we've got great financial advisors, accountants, and dealing with the emotions is either a divorce coach or a therapist or a counsellor, and we put them in touch with those people if they want it. Of course, they have to be ready to engage with those people to help with that side, because as much as we will be there for our clients as well, they a lot of the time need that additional support, and those people who are qualified to deal with that, which leaves us to get on with our job and the law and sorting out their financial settlement. And in addition with that, we need other experts, so pension actuaries, financial advisors, accountants, wealth managers. The client needs that team around them to be able to deal with the whole matter. It is a lot.
I think in the course of the discussion, it's quite clear that pensions continue to be quite a complicated and I guess at times, as you said, adversarial element to the divorce. But it's been great to kind of chat through some of your experience, Natalie. Thank you very much indeed for sharing and for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, David.
That's as much as we've got time for on the Today's Family Lawyer podcast today. It's available on your preferred podcast provider and also available on today'sfamilylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Natalie. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at today'sfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.